So we can start off with a reading from Emmanuel's class, the Miriam Abraham Hilawi's reading, where she says, "We begin, as all stories do, with land."
Yeah, and discuss how humans have always had an inherent connection to land and say that it is the source of life. So, no matter which community we belong to, we all feel strongly towards land.
The time component in this, that's the most interesting bit. How we all have these histories that are true and real for different people, but why do we always have to pick one?
Exactly. And the fact is that histories and time aren't binary, it's not black and white. So, if we know that time has been used as a measure of control and subjugation, what if we attempt to break down the institutional structures that influence such thinking, especially in areas of conflict, and start referring to time as queer? But also, we should clarify here what queer means, a trait that allows time to exist on multiple axes and to uphold several identities at once.
And where multiplicities surround a singular piece of land, that's where it often becomes complicated. And well, ugly. So let's circle on conversation around that. I'm Hadas Rosenthal.
And I'm Vaishnavi Chandrakumar, and in this episode of What If, we're thinking about what if time was queer. Radio is an investigation by advanced architectural design students in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. As a cohort from a plurality of diverse backgrounds, we aim to observe the many polycentric entanglements of architecture. We explore the questions of how we expand the traditional role and associations of architecture between assemblages into relationships, bodies, and technologies, beyond simple scalar translations. So, this conversation really just started off by talking about places and times of conflict. When we have so much about this particular topic in the news, we wanted to think more deeply and definitely more sensitively about why these conversations spiral into the extremities, forcing people to choose sides. One of our main arguments in this episode is how we desperately need to dissect the way opinions are formed, sometimes even more than what the opinion really is.
Exactly. I often feel that for the sake of having a conversation, situations are flattened instead of simplified. Sometimes it happens from an honest attempt to create a more accessible conversation, but the result is usually a superficial rendering of the complexities that for the most part happened when multiple realities are layered on top of each other.
So let's break down what we actually mean when we say quote unquote multiple realities. With this episode, we're trying to understand the unconscious biases that influence most of our perspectives and how we could create conversations that could lead to more accountably inclusive discourses for territories of conflict.
Okay, so let's use a specific case study that is closer to home for you, Vaish, the Ayodhya conflict. For those of you unfamiliar with it, this is a case that went on for 140-odd years from its legal inception in court in 1885. It is a contested holy site for two religious groups in India, Hindus and Muslims. At the time the suit was filed, on site was a mosque, Babri Masjid, that had been constructed during the Mughal rule in India in the 1500s. The argument for the case was that historically, or mythologically, however you wish to say it, Ayodhya is the birthplace of Lord Ram, a god to millions of Hindus who believe that the site of the mosque rightfully belongs to them and therefore must have a temple.
As we found ourselves discussing this case, we thought we could use it to deconstruct ideologies inherent to socially charged situations. We used a slightly different format where we posed this topic to three different people and we gave them each this excerpt and a question, which read as:
One of the most controversially debated cases in India was the Babri Masjid Ram Mandir dispute, or the Ayodhya dispute, which was finally resolved by a Supreme Court ruling in 2019. Fueled by communal tensions that have compounded over the last 200 years, the state of the existing relationship between the Hindus and the Muslims in India today is a portal to its future and the legitimacy of democracy. On the event of the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya, what image does that portal create for you? How do you feel about the entire situation?
So, Hadass and I started to think about this issue as a possible topic for the podcast a few days before the inauguration of the temple. And by the time we sent the prompt out in India, the temple was being inaugurated and celebrated by the Prime Minister just ahead of his re election campaign. Our respondents were a mix of people, old and young, familiar and unfamiliar with the case.
So let's start with the first response from a 26-year-old Indian Christian respondent, whom for the sake of this conversation we will refer to as M. M starts off by saying,
As a neutral Indian who belongs to neither the Hindu nor the Muslim community, I am pro the construction of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya.
I would argue that this is our first point of critique. You hear this a lot, usually amongst the younger generations, where they identify as neutral, but simply by saying that he is for the construction of the temple, he has aligned or even rationalized the situation in whatever arbitrary way that works with his belief system. I think it's important that people carefully use their words with more intentions to say what they believe in without fearing of being ostracized for having an opinion.
I agree with you. Even while thinking about this topic, I remember how we debated which word to use instead of neutral, because that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Start discourses about how not to be neutral, but rather aware. In a way which says, yes, this is my history, but there is also another person for whom the opposite may be true, and that is their history. So, this is our first point towards defining queerness in time. However, we do not want to come off as naive and ignorant, trying to say that, oh, you should be open minded, because there are also so many facts and numbers that speak to violence that are happening as we write this episode.
Yeah, definitely. And this is probably a good spot to state the importance of being critical about the sources we draw information from, especially in this era when we consume so much of our data from social media and sometimes forget that it is designed to do the exact opposite. It amplifies our own voice, often at the expense of hearing others. But coming back to our first response, M says that despite belonging to the Abrahamic religions, he feels that the construction of the temple was the right decision because he views
Churches, mosques, and synagogues are spaces of congregation where the site does not hold as much importance, except on the rare occasions where it was testimony to miracles or divine intervention. On the other hand, Hindu temples are more often than not built on sites that hold significant importance to the faith as whole. All major temples are built on sites or locations that have some historical context with regards to their epics and other religious scriptures.
Well, there is definitely truth to that statement, at least one that I personally resonate with. It comes from a place of objectivity that removes all emotional and sacral associations or religious sentiment that people feel with this case, especially when it manifests itself into a physical form that is visible to the human eye, which is a grand temple in this case.
M goes on to say that he, however, does not support the way the whole situation was publicized, and he is absolutely right here. The spectacle of the whole event, the celebration of it, was a very concrete and real way of the government reinforcing the idea that a group of people have won the fight and the other hasn't. It was memorialized as a victory that, instead of finding a common ground for the conflict, sealed its fate forever, complicating the already complex relationship between the two communities that exist.
He ends on this almost dismal note where he is saying,
Should a similar issue arise in the future, I strongly doubt there will be an amicable solution. It was an opportunity for all the sections to show camaraderie and respect for each other. The rift only seems to widen, and it is a tragedy that the country couldn't come together for an event that holds such importance to such a large majority.
And this brings us back to the first point about neutrality, which in a way can be synonymized as a lack of interest, indifference, and maybe even a nihilistic attitude that seems to be festering across the world. The idea of what's the point, which is definitely an issue. But even stopping to think about this crisis is a step towards addressing the problem.
So M is a friend of mine, and I tried to start this conversation on a group chat with people who are close to me, and I've known them for years. But there was so much resistance to voicing their opinion, and at the same time, my entire social media was flooded with images of the new temple for the 2 or 3 days around its inauguration. People chose to use the platform and method of posting stories to, in a way, show their alliances. In our digital age, there is so much misinformation and superficial content out there that it leaves critical data out of the system, and that's what creates divides. So in the sea of orange posts that I was seeing
Let me stop you here for a second. For our listeners who aren't familiar, orange is the color of the Hindu flag.
Right. So, among all these orange posts, there were a few voices opposing and challenging the status quo, but the numbers were so poor that the effort almost felt insignificant. Let's look at another perspective here. Sadly, our respondent pool was restricted to the male gender, and that might itself be something we should have addressed to create a more equitable representation of voices. But due to logistical constraints, this is the data we're working with.
Well, and we surely do claim that patriarchy doomed us.
Okay, I agree with that. I remember that conversation we had with your building superintendent. Let's call him D. That was an interesting perspective, not so unique to how the majority of India thinks. Do you want to summarize that conversation with him?
Yeah, this was a particularly interesting conversation for me. Just the sheer excitement about the whole topic was fascinating to watch, or hear, if I'm being more precise in our context. For D, this whole story was about the historical fact. He emphasized that there was an entire investigation and a historical research of the site and its surroundings, which concluded that the Hindu history of the place was prior to the Muslim one. Then, he specifically mentioned the Muslim judge, who was one of the 5 in the Supreme Court bench that unanimously ruled in favor of the temple, as a sort of reaffirmation of that chronology by an Islamic representative, in a way that, according to D, sheds an objective light on the Supreme Court rule. Or, simply put, if even the Muslim guy approved it, that must be right.
This whole experience, the way you just described it, is so familiar to me. I've heard this in so many different versions back home. I would say there is a fundamental compartmentalization of religion versus rationality that we all make in our minds, whether you're progressive or conservative. And that might be where we begin to have a conversation. It's which half do we let dominate?
I just want to use this quote from another one of our respondents. A is a 23-year-old American providing us with a quote-unquote outside opinion of the case. And he goes,
The inauguration of the new Ram temple in Ayodhya has a disconnect between its spiritual history and physical intentions. The original monument presented a labor-intensive detail which embodied religious belief and faith. The new construction project presents the same temple via a digital rendering, built using large modern cranes. What's so monumental about it now? Is the temple not just an installment using power? A temple in the catharsis of a site? I challenge the temple to be part of the current times, to be monumental within technology, and to present its relevance to spirituality and counter formalities. Again, spirituality as alternative empowerment within the age of the techno-socialities. This temple to the current age of religion could single-handedly be absent from strategies of belief.
What I find interesting in A's response is that he's actually offering us an architectural framework for this dispute. Without sounding too naive, I think it would make an interesting experiment to provide architecture students with a brief for an alternative temple or a worship space that would answer everybody's needs. Of course, we're both aware of the fact that just like most of what's happening in the world, there are major forces in play here besides the actual physicality of Babri Masjid that probably benefit from that polarization in one way or another. So the point of that proposed experiment is not to conveniently ignore these complexities, but rather to use architecture as a tool that starts to mitigate between all these ends.
Let me just add here, being an architecture student myself, and I've thought about what the ideal proposal would look like. And in this context, I keep circling back to a haptic, non-specific space that can be meditative and reflective to different communities. Something that is guided by the landscape and natural elements as opposed to hard edges and enclosures.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is that there is a queering of the program and the space itself?
Right, yeah. So the space welcomes different activities and subjectivities. So moving on, A also touches on the idea of being off time here. In challenging the temple to be part of current times, what A is really saying is that we have to first and foremost rethink what it means to worship in our times. The masjid was built 500 years ago to accommodate the religious needs and the power structures of that time. The same was done for the worship site before that. Religious practices and power structures have evolved since then. Time has changed for better or worse, and the space must reflect that. There is a contemporary aspect to this matter that has been entirely left out of the current newly inaugurated temple.
Taking this whole conversation as a template, the number of tangents we've digressed into is truly incredible. That process itself kind of reveals the idea of positionality, a bias that allows you to think about your beliefs and a bias that allows you to contest another person's bias. We talked in length about what religion means to each of us, and you mentioned to me how you find solace in a non-functional temple, where you can actually see a myriad of people coming together irrespectively of their ethnicity. The possibility of that is based on the fact that being religious is actually removed from the religion itself.
So, coming back to the non-space that I mentioned earlier, in such contexts, what do you think that the site itself would do?
Well, if I was the place of worship, I would want to be euthanized. Not in a pessimistic, giving up kind of way, but in a constructive sense.
Okay, can you explain what you mean by that?
The Hebrew term for euthanization is hamatat chesed, and it could be translated as either death by mercy or death by grace, and could be either passive or active. I think of it as a really beautiful thing or a concept, a person taking control of their own life, even at the very end. So now, when our site is euthanized, it liberates itself from its religion's constraint to a point where it's both no man's land and all men's land.
I have to admit that sounds very poetic. So what you're saying is that, what if the site or building went, I quit? It sounds freeing and like there is another chance at new life where you archive the multiple histories for new ones to exist over them.
The existence of this liberated site is, in fact, the beginning of a new kind of chronology, a queer time. This episode was produced by the 2024 Radio Editorial Team, a collective of advanced architectural design students at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Thank you to Dean Andres Jaque and AAD Assistant Director Xiaoxi Chen for their guidance. Also, a big shout out to our director and producer Max Lauder, composer and audio engineer Alex Hamady, and recording engineer Camila Agosto for their support.